Hello and welcome to the first lecture, The Good Lawyer. For those of you who might have stumbled upon this channel and these videos by chance, you're welcome to watch. But these lectures are filmed and uploaded for the online education of students of the University of Maastricht for a course that I teach, which is called The Good Lawyer. So we are talking about professional ethics and the question, what does it mean to be an ethically good lawyer? Not a good lawyer in the sense of winning all your cases. And what I will do today in this first lecture is I will outline a couple of basic principles. And when I already mentioned that in our last tutorial, when I talk about the lawyer, I 99.9% I mean attorney. So a lawyer who has clients. And I'm not talking about judges or prosecutors. They are also lawyers, but my lawyer, the term lawyer, when I use it, I mean attorney. And the professional ethics of the lawyer is characterized by a couple of basic principles, and we will focus on these basic principles today, and then in subsequent lectures we will talk about each of these principles in more, extension. In more detail. That's what I wanted to say, in more detail. The first thing to realize when we're talking about the basics, the fundamentals of the professional ethics of lawyers, is that we have to keep in mind that a lawyer, if you are a lawyer, if you have clients, we need to talk about what your task is. And we also need to talk about the fact that being a lawyer is more than, quote unquote, just a job or an occupation. To the first criterion, the task. It's actually quite simple. The lawyer has the task to advise his or her clients on legal matters and to represent that client in all legal proceedings that might ensue. So it's a twofold task. It's advice and representation. So that was quite easy to answer. And the second aspect that we have to keep in mind when we want to talk about the professional ethics is that, as the name already says, being a lawyer is not just a job, it's a profession. And we mean, when we use that term profession in this context, professional ethics, we mean that a profession has certain criteria that not every job fulfills. If you think about professionals, a doctor, being a doctor is a profession. Being the Minister of Foreign Affairs is a profession. In the Netherlands, we have a king. Being the king is a profession. And that term, profession, requires certain aspects, has certain criteria that you have to fulfill if you want to call some occupation a profession. The first one is that every profession requires a specific expertise. In being a lawyer, it's of course that you should know the law, that you have to train as a lawyer. In most countries, you have to study law in law school, and in some countries, for instance, the US, you also have to sit an exam in order to be admitted to the bar. In addition to that, expertise as a professional also in most countries means that you have to do permanent schooling. So you have to keep up with what happens in the profession. For instance, jurisprudence, the case law that the high courts rule. So you're not done with your education once you are admitted to the bar. You have to have continuous education in your field. And if we look at the Netherlands, for instance, the bar requires you to have a certain amount of education each year. You have to follow courses and you get points for those, and that's a requirement of the bar in order to stay admitted. Expertise, of course, is not something that is only true for the professional. A watchmaker has to have expertise as well, otherwise he can't fix your watch. The second criterion is when you find the most, you can distinguish the best, I would say, between a regular job and a profession. Because a profession means that you render services and these services serve a greater good, a common public interest, a common good. For instance, if you are a doctor, the common good or the public interest is the health care of the people, the population. And if you are a lawyer, you serve your client. That's the service you render. And you do that in order to serve the legal system, the justice system. So that's the second criterion. And criteria is the plural. Criterion is the singular. And you can see, for instance, that a watchmaker, even though she has to have expertise, and she renders a service because she makes your watch, but it's not in service of a quote-unquote greater good. The third criterion is that a profession has to have a specific ethics. There have to be a set of rules that bind every professional in that particular country. So the professional ethics is an integral part of being a professional. And the third and final criterion is that professionals are allowed to a certain extent to self-regulate their profession. That doesn't mean that the state or the government can't regulate anything with regards to lawyers, for instance, or doctors. There are laws in each country. We talked about that just a minute ago. The requirement for the admission to a bar, but for instance, I'm talking Dutch all of a sudden. Sorry about that. The admission to the bar is regulated by federal law. But the bar association, the bar of a country, is allowed to regulate the ethical rules that govern the profession. So in Holland, for instance, you have a set of rules that the Dutch bar comes up with that the lawyers have to follow. And to speak Dutch again, that's called gedragsregels, so the rules of conduct. So those are the main points in order to identify whether some occupation is a profession. Expertise, the rendering of a service, and this service has to serve a greater good. There has to be a professional ethics, and there has to be a certain amount of self-regulation of this profession with regards to those ethical rules. An important thing also to realize, if we talk about professional ethics, so the rules that govern us as professionals, that these rules often differ from what we would call everyday ethics or everyday moral standards, or the private ethics of a private citizen. And to give you one example, if we look at a lawyer, if your neighbor comes to visit you at night in order to tell you very excitedly that he came into quite some money because he robbed a bank yesterday. As a private citizen, the morality or the ethical rules would say you should go to the police and report him. Because he robbed the bank, you shouldn't do that, that's a crime, you report him. But if this man comes to you in your office as a lawyer and he wants advice what the consequences could be because he robbed the bank yesterday, and if the police catch him, what are the consequences, what are the possible jail sentences, and he tells you all about the robbery and he planned it and how he executed it, you can't tell anybody. Because as a lawyer, you are bound by confidentiality. We will talk about that in a little bit, a little more. It's one of the basic principles. But just to give you an example, how the professional ethics and the ethic of every day can differ. So that's an important aspect always to keep in mind, that professional ethics are ethical rules to govern a certain profession, and they can differ in order from the normal rules in order to serve that profession. And if we then look a little bit deeper into the basic principles of the lawyer's ethics, the professional ethics, then we have 5 principles that govern our ethics. And it doesn't matter where you practice, those principles are applicable everywhere. It differs then how each country sort of details what does it mean, but the basic principle is applicable everywhere. The first is, we talked about that already, but it's also a basic principle of this profession, is expertise. You should know the law, and you shouldn't take a case if you don't have expertise in that field of your law. If you done criminal law for 20 years and a new client comes and he wants you to do a labor dispute, you shouldn't do it because you don't have expertise in the field of labor law, so you don't do it. The second principle is one of the most important for a lawyer. The example I gave you with the neighbor goes to that: confidentiality. Confidentiality means that everything that is discussed between you and the client is confidential. That's a basic rule for every lawyer everywhere. How each bar then identifies possible exceptions, that differs from country to country, and we will talk about confidentiality in much detail in the second lecture. So, expertise, confidentiality. The third principle is partiality, and that means that you serve as a lawyer the interest of your client. That's at the center of your work. Not your interest, not the interest of the state, not the interest of some government, but the interest of your client. That's the central aim, your central task. The fourth principle is independence, which means that you as a lawyer, giving your client advice or representing that client in court, you have to be independent. You don't care what the judges think of you, in the sense that you shouldn't misconduct, of course. You shouldn't, I mean, you have to be courteous, but you shouldn't be influenced by what a judge thinks about a case. You can't be influenced by public opinion about a case. You can't be influenced by your opponent's view on the case. You have to be independent in order to serve your client. And the fifth and last basic principle is integrity. Integrity is a pretty broad term, and again, we will talk about integrity in a later lecture, but it means on one important part of it is financial integrity. Every country has rules how you have to deal with the money that your client pays you, for instance, for your services. If you are paid on an hourly basis, you have to register your hours so that you can give to your client, so that your client can see what you worked, how you spent your hours that you charge him. But it also means that you have to have integrity with regards to your profession. Again, we will talk about that in more detail in a later lecture. So those are the 5 basic principles that rule our professional ethics as lawyer: expertise, confidentiality, partiality, independence, and integrity. And in the next lecture, the second one, we will talk about one of these principles, confidentiality, in more detail. This was it for the first lecture. Thank you for watching. I hope that you understood everything, and if you didn't, we have the online session next Thursday, so you can ask questions, and I'll see you all in the next one in the second lecture.